Welcome to Virtual Office Hours, Writing Law School Outlines, sponsored by the American Bar Association and JD Advising. The Virtual Office Hours series connects you with experts to help you thrive as a law student and prepare for life after law school. We're really excited today to have Heather Buck with us to discuss one of the most important tools for studying for exams in law school. That's writing the law school outlines. Heather graduated cum laude and in the top 10% of her class at Wayne State University Law School. She received numerous scholarships and awards at Wayne State and has passed the Michigan bar exams and the California bar exams. After law school, Heather spent 3 years clerking for various judges at the 3rd Judicial Circuit of Michigan. She currently teaches JD Advising's Michigan bar exam, uniform bar exam, and California bar exam courses. She also tutors students for the bar exam, all first-year law school classes, and the MPRE. Heather McNeese is also here. She will help answer questions throughout the program. Hannah is licensed attorney and used JD Advising to pass the bar exam. She worked in family law for 10 years before coming to work for JD Advising, where she now helps students in finding the best fit for them, whether it be pre-law, law school, or bar prep programs. Heather, we'll turn it over to you right now.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you guys for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time. I have lots of helpful tips and tricks when it comes to outlining that I want to share with you guys today. Before I dive into the PowerPoint that I'm sharing that you can see on your screen, I just want to give you a heads up that there is a handout that goes along with it, as well as some additional handouts that you can find in the chat box. Hannah should be posting a link where you can download a copy of the handouts so that you can follow along if you'd like to. Those handouts will be emailed out after this presentation by the ABA. So if you're not in a place where you have a printer handy right now, don't worry, they'll be sent out to you afterwards so that you can take a look at them and go back over all the tips and tricks we talked about. We are also going to be taking questions during this webinar. What you can do if you have a question, if you think of anything while I'm going through the presentation, feel free to submit it using the Q&A feature on Zoom. Once I go through the PowerPoint at the end of this presentation, then I will go through those Q&As that you guys have submitted, and Hannah and I will answer your questions to the best of our ability. So I'm going to get started. And with regard to outlining, there are a couple key strategies and ideas to keep in mind as you're thinking about starting to outline. Number one, make sure you start outlining early. You guys are probably in your 3rd, 4th-ish week of law school at this point. If you have not started outlining yet, this is the perfect time. Please start your outlines as soon as possible. You might not feel ready to outline yet, and that's okay. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about what you can do with your outlines now, how you can improve on them over time, and why it's important to get started early. When you're outlining, your class notes are your most important resource. Your outline is being made to help you with the exam, and your professor is writing the exam. So the stuff your professor is saying in class, that's the stuff that they want you to spit back out when it comes to your answers on the exam. So the notes that you take in class and the things that your professor focuses on, the way your professor presents the material, that's going to be the best resource when it comes to making your outline so that your outline is tailored to your professor, your class, and that exam. Third, it's important that you make your own outline. At this point in law school, you guys have probably come across outline banks, commercial outlines, friends outlines, things like that. I'll tell you how you can incorporate those into studying. I used a ton of other people's outlines, but I always made my own. So making your own outline is incredibly important. Number 4, you don't want to type up your class notes and just call it an outline. That's not really what an outline is. So I'll show you how to make an outline and how it should differ from your class notes. And then finally, you want to make sure your outline is organized in a way that makes sense, in a way that makes sense to you. So your outline is for you. Don't get caught up thinking your outline has to be perfect or beautiful, or that it should be written in a way that someone else can understand it. This is a study tool for you. So if it makes sense and it's helpful to you, that's what matters most. So how do you make an outline? So the very first thing you want to do is gather all your materials. So everything that you have for a class, you should get together and have it as you start outlining. This would be things like your syllabus, your class notes, your casebook. If you're using a supplement, any supplement you're using, commercial case briefs, other people's outlines, all of that stuff. Get it all out, get it all together. When I used to outline in law school, I had all of these different book stands that I would put all over my desk. I'd have my computer in the middle and like 3 or 4 different book stands all around me so that I could prop up my notes, my casebook, someone else's outline, my supplement, and I could look at it all at the same time and basically condense it all into my single outline. That's the point of the outline, is to get everything you need in this one document so that you don't have to look at all of those other things ever again. So the very first thing you want to do after you gather all that material is figure out the overall structure of your outline. People might have been talking to you at this point in law school about hearing a click. Sometimes for the first couple weeks of school, you're just kind of going through the motions and you're not really seeing where things are going. It can be kind of hard to see the big picture. And then at some point, some people claim that they hear this click where it all starts to make sense. For me, it took about a month before I really started to hear that click and things started to make more sense to me. But what you're looking for, and I think what helped with that click for me, what made more sense, is seeing the big picture, kind of seeing where all of these things were going and how all of this was fitting together. And I think there's a couple places you can find that overall structure or that big picture. One resource to finding it is your professor's syllabus. Some professors in their syllabus will give a breakdown of the different topics that they plan to cover, basically like a mini outline in the syllabus showing what you guys will be covering in class and what you will be going over. That's a great overview of the big picture. That's a great place to start. Some professors do not go into that much detail, or the way that they break it down may not be as helpful. What I always found helpful was the table of contents for my casebook. So I would compare the pages that I was assigned as reading for law school to the topic headings in the table of contents. And I started my outline for every single class by typing up basically that table of contents and looking at the main ideas and then the subheadings that went underneath it. So I've given you an example here in this presentation for a contract outline, and you can see on the screen that a contract outline would begin with this type of kind of overall picture or table of contents. You probably start with contract formation. You might also be covering the chapter on defenses. There's probably a section on statute of frauds. This is just an example, so yours probably doesn't look just like this, but as an idea, this is kind of what you're looking for, those big picture topics. And then within the big picture topic, look for the subheadings. So within contract formation, for instance, the different pieces of contract formation are offer, acceptance, and consideration. I literally typed this up. I typed up the portions of the table of contents based on what pages had been assigned to us in class. And this was the starting point for my outline, was just to see what those big picture concepts and topics were. Once you have the overall structure, you want to start with the first sub-issue or first issue that you see. So as an example here, we're going to look at contract formation and the issue of an offer. So what you want to do as you identify the first issue is start with a rule. See if you can pull the rule for that particular issue. And this goes back to what I said before about your class notes being your best resource. Try to write the rule the way your professor explained it. Because when it comes time for presenting this rule in your exam, you want to be able to spit it back to them the way that they taught it to you. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for you to state the rule the way that they taught it. So look in your class notes for how your professor stated the rule, and then you want to write that into your outline. So here you can see for an offer, the rule is that an offer is a manifestation of intent to enter into a contract, and there are 2 elements of an offer: intent and specific terms. Specific terms include price, quantity, and identity of the offeree. Looking at this rule though, this is a little chunky, kind of like bulky. This is kind of hard to take in a quick manner. So rather than leaving the rule as is, the next thing you want to do is try to break down that rule into manageable parts. So he said there's 2 elements of an offer: intent and specific terms. Within specific terms, we need price, quantity, and identity of the offeree. We next want to break the outline down, break that rule down into these manageable parts so that we could quickly look at it and then quickly say, okay, see what the different parts of the offer are. This is going to make it so much more helpful when it comes time to writing your exam and you have to write a rule statement for what exactly is an offer. Also, we'll come back to this in a little bit, but another thing that I recommend is having your outline memorized, not necessarily word for word, but having it memorized to the best of your ability. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that if they have the outline and it's an open book exam, they can just take the outline with them and they can look everything up. Well, if you're looking everything up as you're writing your exam, you're not spending enough time writing. So the more information that you just have memorized and you can quickly recall and write without looking it up, the better off you're gonna do on the exam. So I don't know about you, but for me, looking at this, where it's broken down into manageable chunks, this is so much easier for me to remember. I'm gonna go back a slide than this. I would take so long to try to memorize this paragraph of chunky information. And to me, this just looks like arbitrary words on a page where I'm trying to memorize the entire sentences. This is gonna take a lot more effort to memorize than something that looks more manageable like this. So the next thing you wanna do is try to break those rules down into manageable pieces. Once you've broken down the rules, now you wanna add cases. Use the cases to illustrate the rules. Many people make the mistake of centering their outlines around the cases. I'll show you an example of this in just a minute and why it's not as helpful. Instead of centering your outline around cases where you have case, here's what happened. Next case, here's what happened. Try to center your outline around the rules using, as we said, the table of contents, the main headings, the subheadings as the basis for the overall structure, and then use the cases to illustrate those rules. Thinking back to thinking of how this is going to be helpful for you on exam. A typical law school exam is a hypothetical fact pattern where the professor will make up some facts and then at the end of the fact pattern, they'll say, discuss the issues. And your job is to say, here's the rule that applies to this particular issue, and here are the different arguments that the parties are going to make. The rules are really like your takeaways from the cases. So when you're writing about the cases in your outline, you do not need an entire case brief. You don't need the facts. You don't need an extensive discussion of the justice's opinion and the dissent and the concurrence. That's not stuff that's really going to be helpful when it comes to tackling this law school type of exam. And so thinking about how you're going to use this information on the exam, what you really are going to need from the cases are like a main takeaway and how the case illustrates the rule that it was meant to represent. As a quick side note, if you're wondering about exams or thinking about exams, there is another ABA office hour session specifically on exams. It's coming up on November 11th, and we will be talking more in depth about how to tackle law school exams in that. But I did want to mention exams now since you're making an outline for the purpose of studying for that exam. And so thinking about how you're going to use this information should really help you think about how to best put together your outline. So you can see here in purple font, I've included a couple cases that illustrate some of these different elements of contract formation and specifically offer. So for example, under intent, we have the Fairmount Glassworks case. And in this case, the court said, even if one or more terms are left open, a contract does not fail for indefiniteness if the parties intended to make a contract. This really emphasizes the importance of that intent element. So if we were writing an exam answer and talking about the importance of the party's intent, we could use this Fairmount Glassworks case to illustrate the importance of intent and throw in this takeaway from the case. What actually happened in this case though, really doesn't matter. It's very likely that it's not going to be useful when it comes to the exam. So try to keep your case summaries short and sweet in the outline and think about what you're really just going to use. After you fill in the important cases, the next thing you want to make sure you include in your outline are hypotheticals that your professor poses in class. If your professor is calling on people in class and saying, well, what would happen if blah, 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 and they include some sort of hypothetical fact pattern, write those down. Write down the hypos, write down the potential answers. Maybe the student who answered the question didn't get it right, but maybe they had a great point or a great argument, or maybe there is no right answer. So write down what students say when it comes to those hypotheticals. And the reason you want to write those down in class and you want to include them in your outline is because your professor is writing the exam. They're going to write a hypothetical fact pattern in the exam and expect you to analyze it. So in class, they're really just giving you an opportunity to kind of see what these hypothetical fact patterns could look like. So including these in your outline is a great idea because these mini hypotheticals could form the basis of a larger hypothetical that shows up on your exam. And having the answers in these hypotheticals in your outline will help you quickly be able to analyze those hypotheticals you see on the exam. So be sure to include these in your outline as well. The next thing you want to include are minority rules, exceptions to the rules, and any parts of the rules that are unsettled. So in purple here, you can see under the price term, price is not needed for contracts for the sale of goods. So this is an exception to the requirement that you have to have a price term to have a valid offer. You don't need a price term when it comes to contracts for the sale of goods. And the reason you want to talk about this, coming back to exams, one of the ways to do really well on a law school exam is to argue parts of the law that are unsettled and to raise arguments that both parties will make. So let's say you have a contracts exam question that has to do with whether or not there was a valid offer. The plaintiff might say there was no offer because there was no price term, and price is an essential term that must be included to have a valid offer. And then you're going to say, on the other hand, the defendant will counter this by saying, but in a contract for the sale of goods, you don't need a price term. The court will fill in a reasonable price term. And so if you have a missing price term, you could still have a valid offer. This is a great way to pick up some extra points on the exam. So this is a great idea to include these types of things and draw attention to them in your outline, because this is going to give you some a great basis for how to kind of go back and forth with the different arguments that parties could make when you're writing your answer to this exam. The last thing you can do is add pictures and visual aids to help you understand and retain the material. So back at the beginning of this, I said, make sure your outline is set up in a way that makes sense to you. This is your outline. So if you visualize these things in maybe a weird way, draw pictures, add pictures. If you're a very visual person, add some pictures that help you retain this material, remember this material, and make sense of this material. On this slide, I actually included a snippet of JD Advising's 1L contracts outline. We are going to provide you with a sample. I think Hannah just posted a link to it in the chat box. You can see a sample of JD Advising's 1L contracts outline. This is something that we include with our law school study aids program. It's a subscription service. Hannah will tell you a little bit more about it at the end of this presentation. But we wanted you to see what this type of outline could look like. And actually, you should be getting both a PDF and a Word document of this particular outline. So if you want, you can take this picture right from the Word document and snip it right into your own outline so that you can use these pictures to help you remember the different parts. And there's more than just this one picture. There's a lot of other pictures in the outline. And certainly if you're a visual learner, make up your own pictures. Make your own pictures to help you remember this material. I drew tons of pictures in my outlines, and I found it very, very helpful to help me visualize the material, which let me remember it and recall it much quicker. So I mentioned earlier, you want to avoid the mistake of centering your outline around the cases. So what I included here is an example of what a lot of students do when they're making an outline. This is probably what your class notes look like, because in class, you're probably talking about the material one case at a time. Your professor will say, okay, let's start with the Owen versus Tennyson case. What were the facts? What was the rule? What was the holding? And so your notes are going to have it broken down like this. Here are the facts, here's the rule, here's the judge's discussion, here's the holding. And then you move on to the next case. looking at this very quickly, this is a ton of information. It's really hard to digest. And I would have to sit here and read all of this to figure out what the heck the rule is when it comes to an offer. Notice that these all fall under the contract formation heading and then the subheading of offer. I can't quickly look at this and know what they mean or know what the takeaway is. So when I'm taking an exam, if I did have to turn to my outline and look this up, I would have to waste a ton of time trying to read through all of this, digest it in the middle of the exam, then turn it into a rule statement, and then start writing my answer to my exam. That is not a good use of your time during the exam. So outlining is the time during which you should really be digesting this material and turning it into a more manageable format where you're focusing on the rules. And as I said before, just use the cases to supplement the rules or to illustrate the rules. You don't want to center your outline around the cases. This just will not help you as much during the exam as if you have an outline that focuses on the rules. I mentioned a couple of these tips before at the very beginning, but now that we talked a little bit about how to make an outline, I want to come back to this. First of all, you should start outlining early. So this is a perfect time to start outlining if you have not yet started outlining. And at this point, I want to tell you, a lot of people tell me what I hear is that they're just not ready to start outlining yet. They say, I don't get it yet. I don't know what I'm supposed to include in my outline. I don't understand like what is going on in class. I don't know how to make an outline. That's okay. Just do your best now. The earlier you start, the more chances you have to revise the outline. So if you start your outline right now, even if you don't feel good about it, you'll have a chance, let's say next week, to come back to what you outlined this week and fix it. So things start to make more sense next week. Come back and revise the outline that you've already made. Work on changing it, adding to it, taking things out that you now realize are irrelevant, and really fixing it up. Every single time throughout the semester that you come back to the stuff that you've already outlined and like take another stab at it, rework it, fix it up, that is another time that you're reviewing that material. So many students wait until the very end of the semester to even start their outlines. So they're starting their outline. Let's say they start around Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving, they're coming back to their class notes from week 1. And that's the first time they're looking at their class notes from week 1. They're basically relearning all of that stuff that you covered in week 1 after Thanksgiving. Whereas if you start your outlines now and you review them next week, you review them the week after, you review them the week after that, you are so far ahead of the game when it comes to reviewing the material and going back over stuff that you've already talked about in class. You are not going to be in the position of having to relearn everything going into the exam. It should hopefully make sense to you and be somewhat fresh in your mind because you've already looked at it so many times. Number 2, the class notes are the most important resource. And this kind of speaks also to the fact that you want to make your own outline. The goal is not to have an outline. A lot of people think as long as I find an outline or get an outline, I can take it to the exam with me and I can look everything up. That's not the goal. The goal is to go through the process of making your own outline. Because as you saw, if you compare that outline I showed you where it was based on the cases to the one where it was based on the rules, the one where it's based on the rules is way more helpful and easier to look at and digest. And it's the process of putting it into that format that's going to make you understand what's going on in class. A lot of times in class, everything feels very overwhelming. It's the time after class when you're working on your outlines, trying to digest this, trying to put it into a manageable format when the learning really occurs. So the goal is not to have an outline, it's to set aside time to make your outline so that you can make sure you're learning the material and digesting it so that when it comes time for the exam, you have a really good grasp on the material. You don't want to just type up your class notes. As you saw with the outline that was based around the cases, it's just not super helpful. You want to try to think about the format of the exam. Think about what's going to be helpful in how you're going to use this information when it comes time for the exam as you're putting this material together. So your class notes are not in the best format. And a very common question I get asked is, how long does my outline have to be? It doesn't matter. This is for you. No one's judging how long your outline is. Your outline might be 20 pages. Your outline might be 120 pages. Either way, it's for you. It's your material, so that's okay. I would say most of my outlines range somewhere between like 40 and 70 pages for my first year classes. That's using like a 12-point font, single spaced, with like reasonable breaks in between information between the sections. But the length really doesn't matter. The goal is for the outline to be your single source of information though, so that once you have the outline, you don't have to go back to your class notes. You don't have to pull out the casebook again. You don't have to turn to those supplements again and look things up. Everything you need should be in your outline. I would err at this point on the side of over-including. And as you go through the semester, as things start to make more sense and you have time to come back to look at the outline that you've already made, take things out. Once you kind of see how things are going and how things work, pull out that unnecessary information, and that might actually help you shorten your outline and make it more manageable. Once you have your outline, and even as you're making your outline, you want to make sure you're actively and repeatedly reviewing it. Don't just make it and throw it aside and say, man, I'm glad I can check that off my to-do list. I made my outline, I'm done. Keep going over it again and again and again. Pretty soon in the next couple weeks or so, you should be ready to start thinking about practice exams. Use your outline to help you take practice exams. And then hopefully the practice exams will help you see any faults that are in your outline. Information that's missing, information that could be reworked, information that needs to be changed, and use those to help you tailor your outline. The more times you look at, review, revise your outline, that's more times that you're going back over that material, making it more likely that that material is going to stick in your head. You're going to have it memorized by the time the exam comes around. Also, make sure you're reviewing your outline with the final exam in mind. And a tip I want to tell you here is go back to your outline and focus on those unsettled areas. We talked about adding in the exceptions. We talked about adding in gray areas of the law. Remember that your exam is going to ask you to present arguments where you'll say the plaintiff will argue that this case applies, the defendant will argue that this other case applies. The plaintiff may argue that the main rule applies, the defendant may argue that the exception applies. So think about that as you're going back over your outline, and draw attention and put notes in there as to the different arguments you can make when there are majority rules and exceptions, where there are gray areas of the law. That way, if those issues come up on the exam, you're going to know exactly what arguments to raise right away. So keep the exam in mind as you're reviewing your outline. I mentioned this already, but now that you have your outline done, what do you do with everything else? You don't need it. Hopefully you don't have to look back at it. Would I get rid of it? No, because it's possible that you made an error in your outline. You forgot something. You might have to go back and look something up just to clarify. So I wouldn't throw your class notes in the garbage before the semester is over. But the goal is that once everything is in your outline, you should just be able to exclusively rely on your outline. It should be a one-stop shop for what you need for the exam. Should you prepare any differently for open book versus closed book exams? No. Just because an exam is closed book, I would still make an outline. And just because an exam is open book, I would still try to memorize your outline. As I said before, if you're spending time looking everything up in your outline, you're not spending enough time writing the answer to the exam. So whether it's an open book or a closed book exam, you should be making your own outline, starting early, reviewing it regularly, and working on memorization of that outline. Try to have it as well memorized as you can going into the exam, either way, to make yourself the most prepared for that exam. I'm at this point going to turn things over to my colleague, Hannah, who's just going to briefly talk about some of JD Advising's products and services, and then we'll come back and we'll answer any questions you guys have. So submit them through the Q&A if you guys think of anything.
Hi, everybody. My name is Hannah McNeese, and I am the account executive here for JD Advising. Thank you so much for hanging out with us this afternoon. We truly hope that this has provided some clarity on creating your law school outlines. We really are here to help each and every one of you achieve your goal of being successful in law school, and we have some great resources that we can assist with that. So there is some more detail in the handout, but the first thing I want to talk about, Heather already covered a little bit earlier, are law school study aids. It is a subscription service, so you can do it monthly or yearly. Through that study aid program, we do offer outlines, flashcards, multiple choice questions, and kind of strategies to help maximize your chances of being successful in law school. We have a free sample that you can check out as well. The link to that is in the handout. It's also on our website. We also provide law school tutoring. So if you're struggling with a class or a concept, we have some fantastic law school tutors that can kind of provide personalized, one-on-one tutoring sessions that really help students learn the skills and the strategies to, take that final exam and be successful in law school. When you get further into your law school career, you'll need to take the MPRE. If you haven't been kind of introduced to that yet, that's our professional responsibility exam. We do have a free course for the MPRE. It's fantastic. If you need some additional assistance, we also offer tutoring for the MPRE as well. We have also some great free resources. We have some guides, additional webinars, blog posts, videos, and we also have a monthly newsletter. So we have great free resources as well. We also offer bar exam help. So when you get to that point in your law school career and you've succeeded in law school and you're ready to tackle the bar exam, we have courses and tutoring and supplemental materials to help you through that as well. We also give free 15-minute consultations. So if you find that you're ever struggling or you just have some questions you want to throw our way, please schedule one or just give us a call. You can do that right on our website. And again, you can do it via email or phone call. We would love to assist each and every one of you in any way that we can. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Heather to tackle the Q&A. As she mentioned earlier, any questions that you do have, please do throw them into that Q&A box and we will get to them. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hannah. Before I turn to the Q&A, just one more reminder. I know I mentioned law school exams a couple times throughout this, this presentation. There is another webinar that the ABA is hosting specifically on law school exams, coming up on November 11th. We do also have another webinar with the ABA on March 24th if you are taking the bar exam. So if you're a little bit further ahead in law school and thinking about the bar exam, or just kind of wondering, what do I need to start thinking about now? If you're interested in hearing about the bar exam, you can join us on March 24th for that webinar. There were a couple questions in the Q&A that I know we typed an answer to, but just in case anyone missed it, if you're looking for either the PowerPoints or the handouts, they're in the handout is in the chat box. You can find a link, and they should also be emailed out to everyone afterwards. So if you missed any part of the presentation, you'll be able to get the recording in the handouts as well. There was also a question about tutoring, which I typed an answer to. How do I sign up for tutoring? So the slide that you should see on your screen right now has JD Advising's contact information on it. As Hannah said, if you have any questions about our products and services, feel free to send us an email, give us a call, or check out our website. Those are the places where you can find more information about that. Okay, I do see some questions in the Q&A. So the first one says, how much detail do you include in the case briefs in the outline? So I kind of touched on this a little bit, but the answer does vary. What is most helpful, if you can, for your professor is get your hands on your professor's old exams. See what they look like. See if it's really a straightforward hypothetical type exam where it's a long fact pattern and you're expected to identify, analyze, and discuss the issues. If you have that type of straightforward exam, you really don't need much detail about the cases in your outline. Maybe a sentence or two about the facts to remind you of what happened in that case. And then what you really want to make sure you include is the holding or the takeaway from that case. Now, that being said, I have talked to a lot of students recently whose professors are not administering A typical law school exam. Like I talked to a student last week who told me their professor was giving multiple choice questions in the exam. Try to find out from your professor how much detail those multiple choice questions are going to go into or what they look like, because they could be a couple different things. I've seen professors whose multiple choice questions are just short hypothetical fact patterns, where instead of writing out an answer like you would in an essay, you just select the answer choice. I've also seen professors whose multiple choice cases are on, or questions are on the cases. So the questions might be something like, in the Smith versus Jones case, what was the difference between Justice Scalia's concurrence and Justice Thomas's dissent? If they're going to ask about those types of things, then you want to include more information. So see if your professor has, like I said, old exams, so you can get a sense for what type of information you're going to need in your outline. The default, I would say, is a sentence or two about the facts and the takeaway or the holding for kind of a typical hypothetical law school exam, but you may have to include a little bit more information depending on the professor and the type of exam they're administering. The next question says, are you able to touch on outlines for midterms? Is there anything you suggest we do differently? Nothing I would do differently. I would just make sure you start early and start preparing for that midterm as soon as possible. So midterms, from what I've talked to students recently about, are usually sometime in the middle of October. Middle to end of October is what I've heard. So you should be at this point well into your outlines for any classes that have a midterm. And in the next maybe week or so, start to think about some practice exams and practice midterms. Now, I know some professors' midterms are not graded. I've heard professors, especially in the first year, will give a midterm where it's just like a good faith effort. They're not going to give you a grade just because they want to expose you to what law school exams might look like, what their exam could look like, and give you kind of a free pass at taking a law school exam without so much pressure. I would still take it seriously. If you have a midterm that is not graded, do not blow it off. That is your best opportunity to see how this particular professor tests things, grades things, and then you have a couple months after that to rework your outline and tweak it based on what you just saw in the midterm so that you can blow the final exam out of the water. So do take your midterm seriously, even if it's not graded. But as far as how you make your outline, I wouldn't make any changes. One question to think about if you do have a midterm is if the final exam is cumulative or not. So some professors will give a midterm on the first half of the semester, and then the final exam just covers the second half of the semester. If that's the case, you probably just need two separate outlines. You may just want to divide your outline into two. Some professors, though, will give a midterm and then they'll give a cumulative final exam. So the final exam goes all the way back to the first day of classes, in which case you're just going to keep working on your outline up until the final and take the whole outline with you into the final if it's an open book, or like work on your whole outline if it's a closed book exam and you need to have it memorized. Any thoughts on positive and negative aspects of outlining in a study group? So study groups in general have pros and cons. They work for some people, they don't work for others. Think carefully about if you are someone who works better with other people. Like, do you need other people around you to stay focused? Do you need to be able to bounce ideas off of other people? Or are you in a study group that's really more like a social club and you get together and not much studying is going on? If it's the latter, I would pass on the study group. I didn't use study groups per se in law school, but I had a study partner. And what we would do is we would make our outlines at home individually, and then we got together and we would take turns explaining our outline to one another. So we would go like chunk by chunk, and I would explain a part and then she would explain a part. And I found it really helpful to hear someone else's perspective on the material. Also, it was a great way to make sure we didn't miss anything for our outline. So we were able to kind of fill in some extra details if one of us thought of something or maybe heard the professor say something that the other person didn't have or didn't hear. So they can definitely be very helpful. I would say the biggest warning is just make sure your study group is being productive. There is a ton of work to do in law school. There's not a ton of time to waste. So that's not to say you have to be holed up in your room like a hermit crab the whole semester. But if you are studying and not a whole lot of studying is going on, that's not a great use of your time. So just be kind of judicious about how you're spending your time. This one says, do you have any suggestions about how to organize a printed outline so you can move quickly to a section, tabs, highlighting, etc.? I think this is most important for an open book exam. If you have an open book exam where you can take your outline with you, I would 100% recommend taking some time to organize your outline. I tabbed my own outlines based on, if you remember back to the slide where we had the breakdown of the main sections for the contracts, I would tab according to the chapters, and then I would tab important topics along the side. So I would have like contract formation, defenses, statute of frauds across the top. And then down the side, I would have things like offer, acceptance, consideration, and then the different defenses so that I could quickly skip right to a particular section if I needed to. Because if you are taking your outline as a resource to use during the exam, you want to make sure that you are going through that outline as quickly as possible, and the tabs are a great way to do that. I also would color code my outline. So I color coded like rules in one color and cases in another. So in my contracts outline, for instance, case law I put in blue, and anything that came from a restatement I would put in red, just so that I could quickly see the differences. And then going back to how you could use this, if you're making an argument in an essay, and one party might argue that this case applies, and the other party might argue that the restatement applies, if they're different, you can quickly see those differences if you have them color coded. Do what works for you though, just kind of play around with it. That's not something you have to decide right away. You could always make your outline and then go back and figure those things out afterwards. The next one says, when taking an exam, would you recommend writing your outline on your exam or on a separate piece of paper? I would keep your outline separate. And if what you're talking about is like maybe writing out a quick version of your outline just so that you can spot the issues and go over what you should be talking about on the exam. Actually, I want to clarify. If we're talking about the outline that we just talked about making, I would definitely keep it separate. If you're talking about outlining an answer to an exam, that I would actually do on the exam. So if you're going through a fact pattern on the exam, and let's say it's contracts and you see that there are issues like contract formation, specifically offer, you see a consideration issue, you see a statute of frauds issue, I would write those right into your exam. This is assuming that you're typing your exam, so that you can just use those as your headings to discuss the different issues. Then you don't have to rewrite them again. And you also don't need to like worry about forgetting any of them. They're already right there in your exam answer. So that maybe if you don't get to one of them at the end, you can at least show your professor that you thought about it, you identified that issue, even though you ran out of time before you could fully discuss it, you already have it there. So maybe you get some credit for having at least brought it up. This question says, did you use Adobe to do that? And I'm assuming you're asking about tabbing the outlines and organizing. Check with your professor. Okay, check with your professor because some will not let you access other materials on your computer during the exam. So you may have to have a hard copy of your outline with you. And this was always the case for me. I had to have a hard copy of my outline. The software that we used did not let you get to anything else on your computer other than taking the exam. So I would always print my outline out and I would use like sticky notes or sticky tabs to tab my particular outline for that class. So I didn't do it electronically, I did do it manually. It was probably one of the last things I did. This would be like the night before the exam, I would tab it because that way I could keep working on my outline, I could keep making revisions, keep editing it. And then once I was 100% done, completely done and ready to print it, that would be the point at which I would go through and tab it. That would be like the last step. This one says, are outlines usually typed rather than handwritten? I would say yes. Most people, in my experience, type their outlines. That way you can move things around. You can make changes. It's easier to have, I think, an electronic version that you can keep working on throughout the semester rather than having a handwritten, because then you're going to be shuffling papers around. You can more easily lose part of it before the end of the semester. Heaven forbid you lose your whole outline and then you have to start over. Whereas if you have it in an electronic version, you have it stored. So hopefully you can come back and recover it should, God forbid, anything happen to it. You do not want to lose all that hard work you've been putting in all semester. If you want, one thing you can do as you're going back over your outline, I always found this helpful, is to handwrite out some notes. Like if you're someone who memorizes by writing things over and over and over, I wouldn't sit and recopy your outline word for word, but you could go through and make like a mini version of your outline and handwrite it. I'm definitely someone who handwriting for me makes it stick in my mind a little bit better. And so you can use it as a method of memorizing, a method of reviewing and going back over the material, but I would probably recommend having an electronic outline. All right, I think I answered that one remaining question. Does anyone else have any others?
Well, it looks like we covered a lot of material here in the short period of time and answered a bunch of questions. So it was great. So we want to thank everyone for joining us today, and a special thank you to Heather Buck and Hannah McNee and JD Advising. We hope you'll join us for upcoming virtual office hours programming, including the November 11th How to Excel in Law School exams, and March 24th, 8 essential tips for first-time bar exam takers. Visit our website, abaforlawstudents.com, to register for these programs and for the full lineup. Take care, everyone.